This is China, and these are the neighbors China has, or had, border issues with in recent history. Yes, it's a lot. US-China relations have not been the best, to say the least. China is the biggest threat to America's throne as an economic superpower, and America is the biggest threat to China's authoritarian regime. But America isn't the only country that China isn't friendly with. It has many territorial disputes with its neighbors. These include some big superpowers like India and Japan, and also relatively small neutral countries like Bhutan and Nepal. In total, China has some form of a territorial dispute with 19 of its neighbors. And the problems don't stop there. The list of China's allies is short and thin, while the list of its enemies is long and growing. So this begs the question, why does China have so many enemies? To address this question, we'll start by looking at the land disputes that it has with its neighbors, and then we'll move into the naval problems it has in its region. In addressing these problems, maybe we'll have the clarity to understand the modern motivations of the country in picking so many fights on so many fronts. Also, please be sure to hit that like button. Our recent videos have been getting suppressed by YouTube, and so your likes help out a lot in terms of the YouTube algorithm.
India has claimed
20 of its soldiers have been killed by Chinese troops.
Indian Prime Minister says his country is hurt and angry.
The Chinese diplomats have been quite vocal. They've even asked India to discipline its military.
This is the first deadly clash on this border in 45 years.
The deadliest in 4 decades.
The first nation on our list is a unique one because, well, China has beef with a country that considers cows sacred. We cannot talk about land disputes that China has with its neighbors without first mentioning India. India has been one of China's biggest pains for decades. As India grows, exerting more influence on the global stage, so too does its rivalry with China. A huge part of this rivalry comes from China's ongoing disagreement with India over its land border in the Himalayas. Basically, the India-China border can be broken down into 2 major contested sectors. The first is this western sector that comprises the Aksai Chin region. This region was originally part of the state of Jammu, and Kashmir is claimed by China as part of its autonomous Xinjiang region. After the 1962 war, when China defeated India, the land was administered by China. It is the second largest Indo-China border area, covering over 38,000 square kilometers. However, it's all uninhabited land. While India claims the entire Aksai Chin territory as well as the Shaksgam Valley, which was Indian territory gifted to China by Pakistan, China contests Indian control over Daulat Beg Oldi, a tehsil in Leh, south of Aksai Chin, that is believed to host the world's highest airstrip. Another area of contention is this eastern sector that comprises the Arunachal Pradesh region. China claims this land to be its own, and it is the largest disputed area, covering around 90,000 square kilometers. It was formerly called Far East Frontier Agency. During the 1962 war, the People's Liberation Army occupied it, but they announced a unilateral ceasefire and withdrew, respecting the international boundary, also called the McMahon Line. However, they have continued to assert their claim over the territory. Nowadays, almost the whole of Arunachal is claimed by China, much to the bitterness of India. What makes all this contested borderland tricky is that the land has rivers, lakes, and snowcaps along the frontier, meaning that the line can shift, which causes further tension between India and China. Basically, each country claims the land is theirs, and this fuels tension. Clashes and confrontations of the land have happened several times throughout history in years like 1962, 1967, 2011, 2017, and more recently in 2020. As the two nations continue to build infrastructure along the border in competition, for example, India's construction of a new road to a high-altitude airbase, Severe confrontations occur between the patrolling troops on their side. The last altercation in 2020 was particularly significant because it was the first time in very modern history that deaths occurred over the border dispute. Indian media reported that at least 20 Indian soldiers had been ambushed and killed by over 300 Chinese soldiers. It was reported that they were clubbed to death by bats that had metal spikes, barbed wire, and nails. An Indian army officer said, "Even unarmed men who fled to the hillside were hunted down and killed." More skirmishes have occurred in the area, with some reports involving gunfire, although no gun casualties have been reported. The prospect of all-out war remains a possibility, and with tensions already high, little is needed to trigger it. Thus far, the two countries have fought only one war, in 1962, when India suffered a humiliating defeat, and China seems to be convinced of its maintained superiority over India. However, now a war would be devastating, as both sides are established nuclear powers. As you all know, no one wins in a nuclear war. In addition to that, the economic fallout would be massive, as China remains one of India's biggest trading partners despite the conflicts. One thing is certain, neither Indian Prime Minister Modi nor Chinese President Xi Jinping will admit defeat and cede this borderland. And until that happens, tensions are bound to remain high, and the prospect of war remains high with it. Another source of conflict that China has is its land dispute with Bhutan. The border between the two nations spans approximately 500 kilometers and has been the site of several territorial disputes. The western section of the boundary was first established during the 19th century between the British and Chinese governments and goes along various mountain ridges. However, the exact contention area on the borders remains unclear and obscure. This, of course, has not helped to solve the issue, and that has served as a significant factor in the onset of many of the territorial disputes between the Bhutanese and Chinese governments to date. Both nations have, over the past few decades, asserted their various claims and arguments towards the ownership of the land. But this has not gone very far. This is primarily because the disputes themselves are not even coherent. For example, the Bhutanese government contends that there exists 4 contested areas along the border, while China argues that there are 6 areas of dispute. Over the years, tensions surrounding the borders have risen, with the dispute over the Dak Lam region escalating into a standoff between Chinese and Indian forces in 2017. The area became the site of a standoff between the armed forces of India and China following an attempt by China to extend a road coming via Sinchle further southward on the Dak Lam Plateau. India does not have a claim on Dak Lam, but it supports Bhutan's claim on the territory. This is mainly because Dak Lam lies adjacent to India's Sikkim region, which is a crucial strategic area for the Indian military. Continued Chinese encroachment into Dak Lam prompted the Indian government to respond with the deployment of troops near the disputed area. Diplomatic efforts have de-escalated the situation, but it's still a very hot topic. With India supporting Bhutan's land claims, this creates a lot of tension in the area. Tensions that can easily turn into armed conflict. This is an outcome that no one wants, but the Chinese Communist Party, along with President Xi Jinping, is not willing to move a single inch. One can only wonder what the diplomatic talks that have been ongoing since the 1980s will achieve in ending this decades-long dispute. Talk about overcooked beef.
It is targeting the Tibetans.
The territory has been closed and controlled by Beijing.
China's state media often comments on Tibet, pointing out that it has always been part of China long before Hawaii became part of the United States.
And that the Dalai Lama
Has long been a thorn in the flesh of the Chinese government.
the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism who fled Tibet in 1959.
Beijing openly calls him a jackal in monk's robes.
These 50 years have brought untold suffering and destruction to the land and people of Tibet. Today, religion, culture, language, and identity are nearing extinction. In short, the Tibetan people are regarded as criminals deserving to be put to death. However, the fact that the Tibet issue is alive and the international community is taking a growing interest in it is indeed an achievement. I have no doubt that the justice of Tibet's cause will prevail if we continue to tread the path of truth and nonviolence. These are the heartbreaking words of the 14th Dalai Lama, said back in 2009. Of the many land disputes that China has as it continues to make several enemy states, this is perhaps the saddest and most egregious. Unlike the other disputes, we've talked about various sections of borderland. With Tibet, the whole country has been illegally annexed. Back in 1950, China enforced a long-held claim on the Himalayan country and incorporated it into its own territory forcefully. The Tibetans tried to resist, launching an unsuccessful uprising in 1959 that resulted in Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, fleeing to India where he set up a government in exile. He resides there to this day. To this day, Tibetans say theirs was an independent society and they were never a part of China, while the Chinese say Tibet had always been a part of China. They have been illegally occupying the land for several decades now, in a move that has been condemned by several countries, including the United States. In advocating for Tibetan rights, U.S. Texas Representative Michael McCall has been on record saying, "The Chinese Communist Party's invasion of Tibet in 1950 and its repression of Tibetans ever since set the stage for the CCP's ongoing territorial aggression and human rights atrocities. Their attempts to steal people's freedoms and rewrite history continue to threaten American values and our national security interests today." To date, Tibet is rated as the least free country in the world, as a result of the Chinese occupation and oppression of its people. China is not likely to release Tibet from its grip, with them having committed egregious crimes such as kidnapping Tibet's spiritual leaders in a bid to appoint their own puppets. Under China's occupation, Tibet has been divided up, renamed, and incorporated into Chinese provinces, with little reference to the original borders between Tibet's provinces. What China has done in Tibet is a disgusting act of oppression that hardly anyone can argue for. But hey, that's just another regular day according to the CCP. Despite the severity of the issues we've discussed, China has no shortage of problems with its other smaller country neighbors. China has long had disputes with Nepal, its neighbor, over claims that parts of Nepal are Tibet. This has escalated in recent years, with China annexing Rui village in Nepal, claiming it as part of Tibet. Further reports suggest that China keeps encroaching on Nepal's territory. Laos is another victim of China's aggressive expansionist policy, as the communist country also alleges that it owns large parts of Laos on historical precedent dating back to the Yuan dynasty. These claims make China aggressive, and because of its might, it threatens to push around Laos to get what it wants. Mongolia is yet another victim of China's border disputes. As much as the Mongolian government has not been involved, Inner Mongolia, an autonomous region within Mongolia, has also been involved in territorial disputes with China. The last border flare-up between the two regions was as recent as 2015. This dispute is not nationalized and is regarded more as internal affairs between regions, but knowing the CCP, their fingerprints are all over that. Possibly the last land border dispute we'll discuss is the Myanmar one. The two countries share a 2,185-kilometer-long border based on a 1960 agreement. However, in 2020, Myanmar began to accuse China of creating trouble on the border and instigating terror groups. This is a scary accusation to level, and one can only wonder how far deep the scheming of the CCP in taking land over from Myanmar will go. China's aggressive expansionist policies aren't just land disputes, but naval ones too.
In the South China Sea.
South China Sea, the hotly contested body of water.
The 9-dash line delimits the ownership
of the islands of the South China Sea are China's inherent territory.
China has conflicting territorial relations with
borders of these South China Sea countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia.
Chinese vessels are fanning out across waters.
Japanese media has also reported that Chinese Coast Guard ships entered the country's territorial waters for a second day in a row.
The Philippines and China have dispute over the area in the South China Sea. In particular, the two countries are sparring over the Scarborough Reef and the Spratly Islands. While China has offered to negotiate, the Philippines has said these territories are non-negotiable. and have always been a part of their country. The problem comes in that basically China has claimed the entirety of the South China Sea, which overlaps with the West Philippine Sea. The issue got heated to the point that the Philippines took China to court and scored a victory against them in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, the Netherlands, in 2016. The arbitration court declared Beijing's claim over nearly the entire South China Sea as illegal. However, in typical CCP fashion, China refused to recognize the 2016 arbitral ruling. The United States has openly come out backing the Philippines in this, with the U.S. Embassy in Manila last year releasing a statement saying, "We stand with the Philippines, our oldest treaty ally in Asia." The U.S. Embassy also accused China of using maritime militia to intimidate, provoke, and threaten other nations, which undermines peace and security in the region. In November of last year, Chinese vessels had blocked and used water cannons on 2 Philippine supply boats that were heading to a disputed shoal occupied by Filipino Marines in the South China Sea. The hostility, which triggered an angry protest from Manila, was the latest flare-up in the South China Sea, with China claiming virtually the entire waterway. The truth is that Manila is facing a deadlock in a dispute that it cannot resolve alone. And while an armed conflict directly involving the Philippines is unlikely, there remains a growing potential for incidents at sea to escalate. And if China is allowed to take what it wants, who knows how far that entitlement will go. China and Japan have also repeatedly clashed over a group of uninhabited islands called the Senkaku Islands in Tokyo, the Diaoyu Islands in Beijing, and the Taoyutai Islands in Taiwan. These are all various collections of clustered several small island groups. China began raising questions of sovereignty over the islands in the 1970s when evidence of oil reserves in the region surfaced. As is typical for a nation seeking resources, they started to make a move on them only to be opposed by Japan. For some years, Beijing has been aggravating tensions by increasing the presence of the China Coast Guard in vessels in the contiguous zone of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Though the threat of war has not broken out over these islands, the two superpowers generally deliver stiff warnings to each other when either superpower oversteps. And to add to the list of its enemies, China has Vietnam as well. The disputes it has with the nation lie in conflicts surrounding the South China Sea. For years now, China and Vietnam have long faced maritime territorial disputes over these Spratly Islands and the Parasil Islands. China used the general claim that these islands, which are a large part of Vietnam, belong to it because they are in the South China Sea, and that sea belongs to them. So deeply rooted in this reasoning, the Chinese army sank a Vietnamese fishing vessel near Vanguard Bank, prompting Vietnam to lodge an official protest. When it comes to the South China Sea, China is being a bully due to the military influence it has over these smaller nations. Malaysia and China have been fighting primarily over the Spratly Islands. In April of 2020, Chinese maritime militia vessels started shadowing West Capella, a Malaysian drill ship conducting exploration activities off the country's coast. When China dismissed Malaysia's objections, US and Australian warships entered the disputed waters. The Chinese vessels eventually left the sea. The claim that the South China Sea and all of its islands are China's is what is fueling all these conflicts in that region. In 2019, Malaysia summoned China's ambassador after 16 military aircraft flew over disputed waters off its eastern state of Sarawak. Malaysia's foreign ministry said at the time that the maneuver was a serious threat to national sovereignty. China's brazenness has not gone unnoticed. Over the last decade, Beijing has adopted an increasingly assertive posture towards Malaysia's territory in the South China Sea. Dating back to 2013, even a Chinese Coast Guard ship has been stationed near Luconia Breakers, an area about 80 nautical miles south of Sarawak. If this does not scream intimidation, I don't really know what does. And due to China's reasoning adopted for convenience in the South China Sea, The communist nation has several other strained relations with countries in the region. These include Indonesia, North Korea, and Brunei. The reasoning is much like the countries mentioned. In trying to dominate and protect its military interests in the South China Sea, the CCP has only served to create enemies for itself, enemies who have allied with the US government, China's rival. The very fear that drove them to expansionist policies have been realized primarily because of those same policies. Quite the irony, if I do say so myself. One major border dispute that I did not talk about in this video was the Taiwan one. This is likely one most people know about due to recent tensions that grabbed worldwide attention not too long ago. Not to worry, however. I skipped over it because I made an extensive video about that matter a few weeks back. Please feel free to check this video out for a better understanding of the matter, with in-depth knowledge of the roots of the conflict. The link to the video will be in the description below. At this point, one has to wonder why China is deliberately creating enemies for itself with an aggressive expansionist policy that has no place in modern times. Well, the reason for this might actually surprise you. As evidenced by the several conflicts that China has started, or at the very least is continuing on several fronts, one can see that the communist nation has taken the role of the aggressor. China has assumed the role of an aggressive, autocratic superpower that has little respect for the rules-based international order. It has amassed enough economic, military, and soft power to impose a new geopolitical and geoeconomic order where its interests will be eternally paramount. Accordingly, China has set about creating a new space for itself by trampling on the interests of other nations. Just like in these border disputes, China has little regard for other nations, just their own interests. To be frank, China uses its economic prowess, the world's second largest, as a weapon to secure its political objectives and bully countries that criticize its policies. I believe that this overshowing of dominance is an overcompensation technique. On the ground, China has so many internal issues that are rocking it from the inside. Some have been going on for years, like the COVID-19 pandemic mismanagement, and some have heightened in the past years and months, like the real estate and economic crisis that's facing the nation. On top of that, China has food and water crisis, and all this just adds to civil unrest. All these problems have resulted in the CCP receiving a lot of criticism from its own citizens. To maintain stability at home, the CCP, through targeted propaganda, tries to unite the nation behind a rallying outside enemy or cause. This has resulted in its overly aggressive foreign expansionist policy. Of course, this is not the only reason for China's actions. Its desperation to secure the oil present in the South China Sea plays a role in it too, but I believe the distraction all this provides is probably the main motivator. To divert attention from all of these internal issues, China is creating trouble along its borders, be it on the LAC with India or other countries in the South China Sea. If nothing else, the CCP and President Xi are conniving and would rather watch the regions burn than give up political power. It is this hunger for power and control that has resulted in China's aggressiveness towards most of its neighbors in the region. If left unchecked, who knows how far the CCP will take this? I leave you with a question, and you can comment with your responses below. As the world's leading superpower, and potentially the only country that might dwarf China's own, do you believe the US should step in as an ally and protect these other countries whose territory China is encroaching on? If you think they should, comment why. And if you think they shouldn't, well, comment why not.